But she's going to talk about needs and dilemmas for in teaching basic science for basic science faculty here at the university.
Thanks, Roseanne, and thank you very much for those of you who came, and I fully understand that there were lots of other competing things. As Roseanne said, I'm a basic scientist, and most of my teaching is done in the first year of medical school. And what I thought I'd tell you about today are some of the dilemmas and associated needs that basic scientists face. Okay? And I know there were titles such as mentoring, and I'll say a little bit about that, as well as dilemmas. But it's basically, well, let me tell you what I'm basing this on. So when Roseanne asked me to do this, or when I began to think about what you as either basic scientists or clinicians might want to know about what basic scientists collectively worry about, I use these basic resources. So I told my colleagues, specifically those that are course directors in the first year in MS1. So now many of these courses have both clinical course directors as well as a basic scientist, and I only pulled the basic scientist. And these were for the anatomy course, which is, at least at the moment, followed by a cell pathology course, genetics, fuel metabolism, immunology, and microbiology. And I will tell you right now, it was a very little poll, and it was undoubtedly very biased because I wrote out what I thought were problems and asked them to tell me what they thought of. I also interviewed informally, or formally, some basic science faculty, especially young ones who were just starting. And then I looked at some publications, and these are given here because these are the ones that I found most helpful. The reason they were largely most helpful is they really do allow us to think more intentionally about our professional activities. They make a lot of, if you're a scientist and you like hard data and you like detail, there were a lot of generalizations, and sometimes I found them hard, and sometimes they were totally focused on clinical training. So I have to say right off, I had a lot of trouble finding any literature at all about teaching basic science, or finding much. But nevertheless, these are the ones that were helpful. A book that really used what we know about the organization of the brain by Zoll to think about teaching. Some articles that actually tested the hypothesis that basic science is important. Then a couple of articles on strategies, and actually the New York Times Magazine article, which came out about a month ago, called Building a Better Teacher by Elizabeth Green. Okay, so what about the poll of the basic science course directors? These are the major areas of concern. And the first one, when I added them all up, or the one that was of most concern to the largest number of these course directors, were the issues relating to either faculty recruitment or where they saw disconnects between how faculty versus students viewed teaching, which really then spun around, all right, again, to impact faculty recruitment. In association with that, but of much lesser concern, was the obtaining of good teaching material. Then there were concerns about both student passivity or passive nature and time constraints. Now, the interesting thing about this, and I'll get back to it, is of all the courses that when it came to student passivity, all the course directors were concerned, except those teaching medical anatomy and micro, okay? And furthermore, insufficient time, most people felt fine about that, except anatomy and micro. Well, in the case I'm going to try to make to you there, the reason there's this distinction between anatomy and microbiology, probably, and cell biology, fuel metabolism, genetics, immunology, may have to do with how the students perceive the clinical importance of it, or the sort of rite of passage nature of it. Okay, so just a little history, and I think most of you already know this. Through the mid-19th century, there was essentially an apprenticeship model utilized in medical schools. Some schools, probably modeling after the German university system, began to be assimilated, some medical schools began to be assimilated into university culture. And these included Penn, Harvard, Michigan, and Johns Hopkins. And this was true as early as the 1880s. But a lot of schools weren't, and a lot were really criticized for being largely institutions of profit. Then in 1910, Flexner published a report, and I would say that this was a report published for the general population, for the public, on how he felt medical education ought to change. And it was based on his traveling around the country and to Canada and visiting 155 schools. And the long of it and the short of it was that he came away with the strong belief, which he sold to pretty much everyone, that one needed formal training in analytical reasoning that is normally provided by studies of natural sciences, and that there were clear, one should make links between scientific principles underlying human biology and disease in clinical decision making. And then, obviously, within about a decade, there were strongly scientifically based programs developed, and this very traditional idea of having 2 years of basic science and then 2 years of clinical training. So one thing you could possibly say is, well, okay, can't the clinicians do this teaching of basic science? And certainly one reason why that doesn't necessarily work now would be that there's such a vast amount of material that we really need a division of labor between basic scientists and clinicians. But if you take a more scientific approach, okay, so what's the evidence that basic science helps? There are some experiments and some studies, several studies by a person named Woods, who's addressed this question. And these, essentially what she did was give first and second year medical students a series of clinical features. I think they were in rheumatology and neurology. Clinical features for various diseases like scleroderma, myasthenia gravis. Clinical features, and one group she gave the clinical features, and the other group she also gave the underlying physiological origins or the scientific basis and scientific mechanisms. The other group she gave the physical characteristics, but she gave some epidemiological information and stuff like that. And then there was a test. And how did they respond? How did they do? Well, first of all, the immediate test, they both did exactly the same, okay? But after a week or so, the group that had the basic science information coupled with the clinical features, when given a new set of characteristics or in a new pattern, were better able to make a correct diagnosis. So, and that's just one example of experiments. Putting all this literature together, the basic idea is that knowledge of basic science especially helps novices develop coherent pictures of a case, okay? Especially when the case is complex or when clinical features appear really disorganized. Learners are better able to retain it over time, as I just said when I talked about the Woods experiment. They also can seem to be more accurate when asked to do a diagnosis very quickly. Okay. So those are the central reasons, aside from the more intuitive ones, that a medical school needs PhDs in basic science. Okay, the other question that might be asked is, with respect to first and second year, especially first year, which is what I really know the most about, not second year. And I should point out that I'm speaking from that vantage point. So why integrate basic? Okay, you could have a curriculum that's just basic, all right? And clearly that's not the way people are going. And the basis for this is that facts and concepts are best recalled and put into service when they're taught, practiced, and assessed in context. in the context in which they're used. Clearly, and everybody knows this, integrating basic and clinical really early adds meaning and provides a powerful stimulus for learning. And then there's in the case of, there's the real changes recently in the board exam questions, which have much more frequently have clinical stems. And then you can go back to our results with anatomy and microbiology as another example of why it's important to integrate. I really think that in microbiology and in anatomy, in talking to the course directors there, that the students, that there is more obvious integration, and certainly the students perceive it as more clinically important from the day they walk in. Whereas cell biology, biochemistry, genetics, immunology, one of the first responses the students are going to have is, I've had that before. Okay? And so I think that's why we saw a disconnect in how course directors responded. Students wanted more time. Students weren't as passive. Or at least that was not perceived by the course directors as true. Okay, so what would we really like? Okay, so this is my sort of analogy of that, and I wouldn't show it to a class because I'm not sure they've seen a movie this old. But, I don't mean to imply that you're old, but I'm assuming some of you at least have remember James Bond and Q. Okay, and I would think about James Bond as the medical student or the doctor in training. Okay, so for those of you who are clinicians, sort of a romantic view. And Q as a basic scientist. Okay, and James Bond's job is to go and get the bad guys. Okay, but he needs Q really desperately. Okay, he doesn't necessarily want to know how Q made this briefcase that's going to explode, and blow up the bad guy, okay? But he really values Q's ability to build those things and wants to keep building it. And when you see all these movies, Q's always there and obviously really respected, okay? So what's the basic problem? Okay, why is that such a romantic or idealized image of money? So the basic problem, well, first of all, this is very straightforward. There's external pressures to do other things in limited time. And I'm not going to talk about, because all of you are aware of basic scientists are under pressure in research. There's limited time because of necessities of developing other competencies of professionalism, social awareness, etc. So there's a lot of pressures. There's also pressures to have more and younger faculty involved. So one of the things I did in preparing for this is I obtained from the Office of Faculty Affairs the dates of hire of all the lecturers in my course, okay, which happened to be 19 lecturers. What I did was just give them a list, and they told me the dates of hire of these faculty, and obviously took off the names, and gave me this information. And we have a really good range in the cell pathology course. People have been here from 2 to 31 years of experience, and it's probably greater than that, because that includes faculty who came here from other institutions. Okay? But 9 out of 19 were hired more than 20 years ago. Okay? And the mean date of hire was 17.8 years ago. Okay? And it's probably greater than that, really, because as I said, it doesn't tell us anything about where somebody, that 19 includes people who came here 5 years ago who had 10 years in another institution.
Is that proportional to the distribution of the department?
So I took the 19 lecturers in my course. They're from lots of different departments. Okay.
So the demographics may or may not be.
So I have no idea about demographics. Okay, and I literally just gave them the list of the 19 people, said, take off the names, and just tell me when they were hired. Okay, so we need more. With the external pressures, so I would say the goal is somehow to make teaching sufficiently interesting and feasible that even in the face of these external pressures, basic scientists will become involved and stay involved. Okay, so all basic scientists aren't like you. In fact, they have certain characteristics if you look at those when they first come here. All right? A basic scientist with a PhD who's hired into a basic science department, which is what I can speak to the most, I don't know so much about those hired in clinical departments, will have had minimal personal lecture experience, if any. They will have last actually attended a classroom lecture 2 to 3 years earlier, before they got their degree. And if they did a postdoc, you can add 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 more years. Often they've spent or worked at a large research institution rather than, say, a small liberal arts college. And in these large research institutions, there isn't a premium placed often on teaching skills, and there's a real compartmentalization of disciplines. That is, the young faculty member may have come from a genetics department and never met an analyst or an immunologist. They have little, if any, exposure to medical students, clinical material, or case study approaches at all. And they're generally exposed to courses taught by a single lecturer. So they're used to real continuity, sort of figuring out the lay of the land, and they often make the assumption that lecturing is what you got to do. So basically, students want this, but they feel like they get this when they walk in on the first day of the first year. Well, not the first day, actually, because they have some clinical exposure. But when they walk in the first day, medical anatomy, and they view that, say, as a rite of passage, so it's not so bad. But when they hit cell biology, which they have before, it is more like this. Okay? So, what about my conversations with starting medical students? Because these were recent conversations I had in preparation for this talk. Okay, a couple of things stood out that were quotes, in fact, direct quotes. So first of all, a young faculty member was very dismayed because she had 2 hours of lecture to give, and she gave 1 hour, and the students all walked out after the first hour of lecture. Okay, now, as it turns out, I'm really going over this with her, I think that's because they figured out exactly what she was dealing with, and she had very clear notes. That wasn't her interpretation at that particular time. So in other words, she was a really good lecturer, okay? And so clear that the students said, hey, I can get this information out of the syllabus. It's clear. I know where we're going here. I'm leaving. Okay. Then another thing that came out of a conversation was this statement, which was, it seems to me, that is to this junior faculty member, as though experienced faculty, including course directors, were saying or said to me, you can't swim, but jump in the water first and I'll tell you how you're doing, okay? As opposed to giving them an opportunity to really see. Because remember, as I said earlier, many have not had much experience at all. Or if they had it, it was many years before. The other common complaints you hear from new faculty members or these are 2 more comments I received. These faculty are really excited about learning clinical material. They really look forward to learning clinical material, but trying to learn appropriate clinical material on my own is very difficult. I don't know what's important and what is not at all. And then I don't have time to find out what came before or after my lectures. Because in some cases, starting faculty are given 1 lecture in a large course, and we don't know what's happened before or after. Now, I could, okay, so let's talk a little bit about what are the reactions of the history of the seasoned PhD. And the first one I'm going to tell you, they have some really, there are positives and negatives here. And on this side here are the positives, and on the far side are some of the negatives. And the reason I put the positives, well, there are lots of positives, but these are positives that, from my own experience, kind of surprised me and were good positive things. First of all, the faculty seem, even though they often work all by themselves in the lab, they really enjoy interaction with students in small groups. People that's, I've been surprised innumerable numbers of times with people that were hard to coerce into teaching, but then they did small groups for a while, kind of built a relationship with the students, and had a wonderful time. They really appreciate feedback. Let me tell you a negative about this. I was talking to a junior faculty member who had called me because he was very concerned about his lectures. He'd given the same lecture, an hour, for 5 to 6 years. And his scores were pretty good at the beginning, but were slowly going down. Okay? Even though the lecture hadn't changed. It's obviously, a problem. But in his view, he said, I'm giving the exact same lecture and my scores are going down and down and down. Okay? And can you give me feedback on this? Okay? And many of the seasoned PhDs, I was surprised, but are still really interested in feedback. They also actively involved in faculty review meetings. So I guess I had envisioned PhDs in many cases being very solitary. And it turns out that I don't find them very solitary at all. They really enjoy collegiate life. What are they concerned about in addition to following evaluation scores? They are concerned by lack of feedback from students or the nature of the feedback. And they miss, they've been here for a while, longitudinal interactions with students. Because in many cases in the first year, instead of teaching in an immunology course where they taught an hour a day for 8 weeks, all of a sudden they might teach just a couple hours for 1 week, which doesn't give them much time to establish relationships with students. Also, they have experience largely with lecture-based curriculum, and they're occasionally anxious about changes or curriculum change. Okay, so how do we think about improving teaching practices and making really good people feel better? Well, first of all, so I tried to read some of the learning literature, and I failed abysmally until about a couple of days ago, where I actually found somebody who put it a little bit into context. So I had to say right off, I really don't understand much about behavioral and cognitive and social learning theories, but this is my take on it from one paper. It's a paper by Wilkerson and Irby, and for any of you who are interested, even though this one's 1998, there's a really recent one in 2010, and this was where I was beginning. These are clinicians in the Department of Medicine at UCLA. And this is where I began to finally, at least I thought, I was understanding. Okay? So you can divide learning problems or levels. You can divide them into 4 levels. And I'm going to talk about 3, because I haven't read enough about level 4. Level 1 is the simplest. And it actually evolved first in the 70s, and it comes out of behavioral studies. And it's essentially the idea that you provide faculty with instruction in small little micro steps on very concrete things like this is how you do objectives, this is how you sequence a lecture, this is how you write questions, and then you drill maybe in practice with what they call micro lectures, and you can. Okay, somewhere in the 1980s, people teaching in medical schools began to really think about cognitive theories. Here, to me, what this often translated into was trying to understand pre-existing networks in a learner's head. So to build on prior knowledge and to be able to understand the learner's preconceptions and basically embed content in a relevant context. In the case of medical schools, that would be linking basically clinical. Then level 3 kind of came into play in the 1990s, where it was specialists in medical education began to think about social learning theories. And here the key seemed to be this, to develop collegial arrangements for learning, to have people, the central theme seems to be to have people interact and really, sometimes in a simple sense, think hard about how their experience relates to their success. And also learning from peers by discussing. Level 4 really emphasizes, which is in the forefront now, and these individuals are actually proposing more curriculum change based on it, and so that might be of interest to you. But it's based largely on trying to build a progressive formation of a physician's identity, and really focus on growth. I can't say too much more about that because frankly, I don't think many people have begun to try to implement it, but I may be wrong. Okay, so how do we at Pitt make teaching sufficiently interesting and feasible? So let's start it with the first level, this idea of behavioral theories and basic skills. And remember I said that the starting faculty member told me, it seems as though you're asking me, you're saying, you can't swim, but jump in the water first and we'll tell you how you're doing. I actually think we're doing pretty well here in the first and second year. They're real consistent. We're trying to develop really consistent templates for teaching. One place we are not probably doing too well is in feedback from faculty and course directors. Some people are really great about this. For example, in the neurobiology course, I know that Dr. Humphrey is very careful to meet with faculty. But in many of the first year courses, the junior faculty member or even a seasoned faculty sees only the evaluations that they got from the students. And these may or may not be gone over with the coursework. And a lot of these papers that I read about behavioral theories and basic skills made it very clear that you needed both. That in fact, not much was gained from student evaluations for the individual faculty member. Okay, the school gains them, the individual faculty member doesn't. They really need to go over those with the course director. Okay, what about the second level? Okay, cognitive theories and really thinking about how students learn. And this to me translates at least for first year students as how do we integrate clinical material. And this is a problem, especially for many starting students, but it's also a problem for experienced faculty who are trying to add clinical material for the first time. Because, frankly, I had one story was relayed to me where faculty got very, very excited about finding out that faculty member who lectured on peripheral nerves and discovered peripheral neuropathy, a disease called Charcot-Marie-Tooth disease, okay? And all of a sudden they discovered, wow, there's like 20 different mutations, okay, that affect this. And it made, by starting with the basic science, which is basic science is new, they could really see that that was very cool, but the lecture actually consisted of basic science and a list of mutations. And that kind of giving a list, especially after when the students asked that faculty member, do we have to know those genes? And the faculty member said no, then it was total confusion. And that seems to happen. But one of the problems is that basic science faculty don't know what problems are really common. And so if there's a simple way, and obviously time is a big problem, but I think we need to try to think of maybe simple ways where clinicians could make a couple of lists or a quick phone call or a quick email to go to people so they could say, tell me, you're a pulmonologist, would you please tell me what is something you really deal with? Because I can look it up. The basic scientists can learn it. It's just trying to decide what is important at all. All right. So I would hope we could find some way to have timely, simple clinician input. I'm going to talk a minute or so about incentives for identifying and designing cases, okay? But I would also think that we really need to think seriously, at least in the first year, about keeping the focus intentionally on basic. In other words, instead of giving every gene involved in charcot-marie tooth disease, which they've never seen, maybe give one example, or maybe don't give examples, and just be very intentional about it in terms of telling students what you're doing. What about the problem with concerns of experienced teachers, including following evaluation scores? Because this bothers me as a course director, and is definitely the case, and has definitely led to my loss of certain faculty who simply said I can't take those scores. And why is it happening when the lectures are the same? Well, probably the simplest explanation is that students that are in class now have access to the explanation of scientific problems that are explanations abound, and beautiful explanations, right, on the web, and they're absolutely dynamite, and they're more and more, okay? So this faculty member hasn't changed their lecture at all, okay? But the explosion of material, for example, on one particular topic, is just enormous, and that faculty has to change it, okay? Because the students are different. And one way that they might recognize that would be to have them actually meet with some students. We tend often, in thinking about course evaluations, to have the senior members of the course, or the course directors, meet with the students. But I really feel, after reading some of this and thinking about it, that I really need to have some of the junior people do it instead. It shouldn't be me. It should be starting point. Okay, what about this third level, which let me remind you, this is sort of the level that came into play in the 1990s, where what was emphasized was experiential learning. In other words, experience a lot, discuss it with your colleagues, and work with your peers to, and it's also means trial and error. Try something, see if it works. Okay, and build on your experience. But do it in consultation but also involving discussion with other faculty. So there was one paper I read by Steiner and a large group who did a systematic review of whether faculty development initiatives work at all. So these massive questionnaires were sent out, and they finally ended up with about what faculty initiatives have you tried, and out of the hundreds that they sent out, there were 53 schools that had actually evaluated in a quantitative manner whether faculty development initiatives worked, okay? And there were several, and there are things that do work. Unfortunately, one of the first things is the longer you spend in workshops and faculty development, the better people got, but a huge problem was getting people to become involved. The major thing I want to say here is that this article, or their results, really highlighted the value of using peers as role models and the mutual exchange of information and ideas, and the importance of collegial support to promote and maintain change. Okay, so what I'm trying to say is we have to change the environment where one faculty member goes and gives one lecture and walks out and is involved in a course at all at any other level. Or at least make it possible. It's not that we set it up that way, it just has to sometimes evolve that way. So what could one do? So as I said at the very beginning, faculty really appear, from my experience, to enjoy review sessions. And I would suggest, and so have others, that we create working pairs or working groups in individual courses. Part of it's sort of taking advantage of the apprenticeship model again. And as I already said, I think it's important to have new faculty meet with students, not just course directors. And that way, first of all, it has the advantage of friendly starting faculty members are a little closer actually to those medical students, but also it would give them more direct knowledge of what student concerns are, rather than it getting filtered to the course director. Another thing that I hope we could possibly consider doing harks back to the concern I got from a couple of faculty members. It was really hard to get course material. It might be nice to have, as I said, course directors have real problems getting good exam questions, well-edited syllabus material, notes with clinical cases, or PBLs, or team-based learning, and good reading material, good web material. I wish we could find some way to make these jobs as important. Give somebody a title like case designer. That's just as important as giving a lecture. There's a little perception, maybe bigger than little, that your goal is to become a lecturer when you come in. And I think I would love to change that culture, because I think it would help course directors, it would help starting faculty and a lot of faculty gain experience with integrating, as individuals, integrating basic and clinical. And it would give us, for example, things we know we probably need, like good clinical cases or good web material. And right now, there's just no premium, or there's no incentive for necessarily doing that. So I would love to think of new titles, like case designer or something. Okay. What I'd like to turn to now is this issue of student passivity, which is something that has concerned a lot of faculty. And what I'm going to do is be a little anecdotal and tell you about a problem that I encountered in the cellular and pathological basis of disease as a course director, and viewing small group exercises. Okay. So I essentially, we combined cell biology with pathology a year or two ago. And I was sitting in, I decided I really needed to learn some pathology. And so I sat through or went through some workshops directed by, both basic scientists and clinicians. And also we've been working on these cases and trying to see how they were, and they were images like this, with things wrong with them. And this faculty member, in what I viewed as a really elegant manner, began to ask the students questions about this issue. And what he essentially did was ask a question, then he waited for a period of time, and it was good so that all the students were obviously thinking about it, and then he called on something. And the term for that is referred to as often as cold calling. In a really negative sense, I suppose you could call it pimping. But in any case, in this group, this happened, and it gave him a real feel for where the students were at. You could see it, because a student would know something, they'd throw it in, we would go through what do you think this is, etc. I thought it was a great session. It was really good. About 9 students doing it. Okay? And he did this for 2 or 3 of these particular sessions. And then I got the scores from the course. And this individual, the lowest scores you could possibly get. And I thought, what's going on? I personally viewed him. Well, shortly thereafter, as a course director, I met with the student representatives on the curriculum committee, and I don't even think I had to ask them. They didn't discuss this individual, but in going through their bullet points of these are the things that really bothered us, this issue came up. And that was, they said completely straight-faced, we don't like to be asked questions. Don't ask us questions. Okay? And, in probing and talking to someone, it was clear this is what that individual, in student minds, had done wrong. Okay? Yeah.
Is that they don't like being asked questions, or
Well,
they don't like being singled out?
Well, okay, that's a very good question. First of all, I thought, it's because, they're worried about the grades. Okay, certainly not that they're worried about their grade, because these were exercises in which the students weren't going to grade it. And we told them that. Okay? It's just 9 students and 1 facilitator.
That's the opposite of my experience.
This is a first year, and that becomes important. Well,
But I mean, another option though is to have the students answer the question and walk out of the room, have them answer it in pairs to each other before you call them. But
you absolutely could. So the question is, do you value pushing somebody to think on the spot as an individual? I agree. And I'm relaying this experience because it's obviously bothering me. I'm not so sure what the story was, but it was very clear in polling the students that this was not the only person. It may also have had to do with the fact that they viewed this person who was a pathologist as, it was different if I did it because I was not a clinician. But if they did it, they were more worried about where things were. What it turned out to be, because I really talked to the students, was that this is what I think was bothering. I know it was bothering. So first of all, these students in high school, college, early work experience, those events are a series of self-defining experiences for any student. And medical students previously defined themselves as being superior in the classroom or in work. And this was a real new experience for them. Okay? And I'm really talking about first-year students because when you actually look at how fourth-year students, well, before I do that, let me tell you one thing. I've been sort of bothered by that event and the evaluations of this faculty member. There's more than one, there are a couple of others. And then I read an article in the New York Times magazine about a month ago, which talked about a new book that just came out called Lemloff's Taxonomy. And this is an individual who's basically dealt with what makes some schools successful. And he's written a book called Teach Like a Champion, 49 Techniques that put students on the path to college. So it's largely, has to do with younger students. But there it was glaring at me, factor number 22, cold calling. This is a really important thing to do, it says, okay? Okay, and it's, why is it so good? It came up again when I was reading this book on the art of changing the brain. And this was written by Zoll, who's a director who works at Case. And he uses what we know about brain function to think about processing. And in that book, they talk again about the importance of cold calling as testing ideas through action. And that there's a great difference between imaging something that you between imaging that you have done a problem and actually doing it, okay? And furthermore, putting images into language is a real test. It makes the image concrete, it converts it into a precise form required for language, and it helps one see details. All right, so what can we do, okay? You can call cold calling or questioning something that takes the curse off it. I think this is sort of important for first-year students. And I'll tell you why in a minute. We can be very intentional about the goals of cold calling, and I think we have to be. It's a little bit like, you can give examples like this parable of the 6 blind men and the elephant, in which 6 blind men are told to feel a different region of an elephant and guess what it is. And one individual touches the trunk and thinks it's a spear, one touches, they cut tusks, one touches the trunk and says it's a hose, one touches the ear and says it's a fan, etc. So the point being that to build a true picture, you need multiple perspectives, and so in a small group, you have to think about this kind of cold calling, not so much as trying to put you on the spot, as trying to look at multiple perspectives and solve a particular problem. One also can learn a little bit from what other students, more mature students, think about cold calling. And you can explain this to first-year students. There's an article by Ware, this was actually an article by 4 or 5 fourth-year medical students, I believe. It's called Painting Perspectives of Fourth-Year Medical Students. And what they came away with is, first of all, that there's good pimping and bad pimping, as we probably all know. Pimping sometimes depends on who you talk to. The term has this negative connotation that you're trying to humiliate somebody or push and push and push till you find they don't know anything. The positive connotation would be that it's gives the facilitator a view of what you know and ability to address questions on the spot. It also is a self-testing mechanism. Interestingly, the medical students who wrote this article felt that about half of them thought it had been a very positive experience. All of them said they were going to do it, okay? But they said that they didn't think it was so great for first-year medical students because they thought self-assessment got too tied up with your relationship with the rest of the group. Let me see, do I have something else? Yeah, so clearly we can do other things, and Rich, these are the kinds of things that we can do. We can institute other forms of self-testing that don't put them on the spot in front of their peers. So the answer initially to your question would be that they were mostly concerned, they didn't care about the faculty so much as they really were concerned about how their peers. So, okay? So we can obviously think of many ways of, a written test. Instead of just being overt and saying, we're going to do this because we think it's important, and explaining, which I think is a viable option too, we can do other kinds of testing. Both, I think, would alleviate some of this problem. Formative exams, questions with audience participation systems after lecture, TBL, associated quizzes. But it is something that, from the literature, it seemed pretty clear that it was here to stay, and we need to somehow think of a way of slowly, maybe, having students learn how to respond to this. Because all the fourth-year medical students that described their experiences in this one article thought of it as an amazingly valuable sort of self-assessment tool once you stop worrying about your neighbors. Okay, so that's basically as far as I want to go. We haven't got the kind of relationship I want, but I think some of these it's made me personally think about is with respect to faculty, is that they're more receptive than I thought to feedback. And the longitudinal involvement, we can't have longitudinal involvement, but finding other ways to make them have sort of a collegial atmosphere and get them involved in other aspects of the course is probably important. I think we need to change what we reward or ask faculty to do. I really do think that there's a huge premium right now on designing team-based learning in cases, and I wish we could have faculty get the credit for doing it. And some of that is just simply convincing them that giving a lecture is not that only thing to do. And then another thing, which I maybe didn't emphasize as much, but comes from some of the social theories, and that is to really encourage faculty to be very intentional. To tell, if you're a basic scientist, tell the students, look, I'm going to talk about the basic science. That's it. Or I'm going to use cold calling, and this is why I'm going to do it. Okay, so that's what I have to say. Thank you.